This is Chris Goldthorpe with ChrisChess.com again, and this is the third of 4 sections on the king and queen versus the king and rook. But save time. Go watch a movie or 100 instead of learning how to do this. If you do, you might miss out on adding a fraction of a rating point to your skill level, because this ending takes a tremendous amount of time to learn and it never comes up. However, if you really feel like you just have to know how it works, along with the king and rook versus a king and a knight, it might better prepare you to learn rook and pawn endings. So this will be section 3 of 4. In segment 1, I explained in great detail how to recognize and how to play Philidor's position, starting with where it was black to move, and then showing you how to bring it around to make it black to move from a situation where it was white to move. In segment 2, I discussed part of the history of this endgame, which is pretty interesting. You should look it up. It includes the development of endgame table bases, Ken Thompson's endgame bases, former U.S. champion Walter Brown being unable to do king and queen versus king and rook in 50 moves, and later a game between 2 world-class grandmasters where one player had the queen, the other the rook, and the guy with the queen was unable to win, thus showing that you don't need to know how to do this to become a grandmaster. But let's take a look at a few situations. I'm going to look at one more second-rank defense, and then we'll look at third-rank defenses this time, because the first one was Philidor's position, the second one was second-rank defenses. So let's turn this like this, and we'll just make a regular board, and we'll come back to the beginning of this. Here's a situation where you might feel like it was a first rank defense because the rook's kind of stuck on its first rank if the board were sideways, but because of where the king and queen are, we're going to regard this as a second rank defense. And what white is trying to do now is arrange this situation where he's preparing for the checkmate. It's always very risky to have the queen 2 from the edge, so when you do that, you have to make sure that black doesn't have a stalemate defense by sacrificing his rook. And that's what he does here. Apparently, that is his very fastest, or actually, that's the slowest way to be checkmated. White is, of course, threatening to mate in 1. If the rook comes off this file altogether, white may have queen to A8 mate, and if he goes to B7 to block it again, we would just capture it and win it rather quickly. So this is a good position or position type to remember. Of course, you could set this up quite a number of ways, maybe 8 different ways on this board. Okay, let's look at that again from the beginning. And these positions are not worth a lot of explanation because the explanations don't usually help people much anyway. This position, this picture in your mind, that's what you're aiming for. He goes there. Now you might go, is that really the best move that black has? I hope you're familiar with this particular resource, as you should be if you study these complex endings with very few pieces. It's called an endgame table base. I put S for setup. Copy Fin, that stands for Forsyth English Notation. It's a string of characters that shows the position. And now I'll go to my endgame table base and input that fin here, Control V, okay, And wow, there's the same position. And sure enough, rook to b7 or rook to c7, it takes longer for white to win from that position than any other. If he goes to b7, we take it, king moves, and then we checkmate. So he goes to c7, and it just stops white from checkmating sooner. So I don't think I need to show you how to checkmate with the king and queen from here. If I do, you're in the wrong place to be watching this video. All right, let's take a look at a different one of these. This one looks like a third-rank defense. Two of the attacker's goals here are to guard the square between the kings, especially if the kings are on the same rank or file, diagonally with the queen on a different rank and different file, and the king facing the king directly. This prevents him from bothering us with a check in the middle. So he comes over to the side. Now, one of the annoying things he will do is called the harassment defense, where he'll bring his rook over and he'll put it on the same diagonal with your king, and it's hard to win the rook because your own king blocks the diagonal attack. If he had gone to g6, there are some squares like this one where it would be possible to win the rook. Best play continues with the check. We're really wanting to get our queen to here and then to pull it back. When the rook is on the third rank, we would like to bar the defending king from one of these center squares along his second rank, which I would refer as the second rank even if it were a file and the whole board were turned sideways. Okay. And we'll continue here like this. Now, it might seem tempting for black to check, but then the king will come here threatening a checkmate, and if he comes back, the white king can back up. Now the rook has got to move, and if it comes off the rank, we have king f6. If it comes off the file, then white may have a way to win it, but we'll look at his best move here. And once again, you see this little square here with kings at opposite corners of the square. King comes over, and we've got our queen 2 files away. Now, if this were along the other edge, this is the move that Yasser Seirawan called incomprehensible when he was teaching. And this is another grandmaster who just admits, I find no sense whatsoever in this move, he said. King e7. Now, from this point forward is a rather recognizable sequence of moves that goes like this with the check, and then we check again, rook goes in the way, then we check again, and the king comes up. And I only know this from rote, and that's the only way anyone ever knows this, just purely from rote. Sometimes a bad move is harder to continue from than a good move. And it comes to the C file, and now we put everything on the same diagonal like this. Once you get this situation, you'll recognize it. And now we lead directly to Philidor's position. And I'm going to leave it here because you've got the first of 4 segments that tells you how to play from this Philidor's position. This is what you're always aiming for, this Philidor's position. So let's say he had played the check. Naturally, we have to be, curious about when someone plays a check. E5 is surprisingly actually the better move. If the king comes over here to bother the rook, it ends up, really, it takes a few more moves. See, he went back here, and then we have to do this again. But if the king goes here as it should, then we'll get the same situation where he goes here, queen goes here, king goes here, queen goes here, rook goes here, queen here, and so on. And believe me, I do know that when I say and so on, you're probably thinking, what? Because you haven't seen this that many times yet. By the time you really know how to do this, you'll have spent at least 100 hours with it and could have learned 2 openings and about 50 different end games or tactics ideas, which would help your play in general a whole lot more. So we go down here, king comes back, and the king would go here. And again, this is one that I know just from having done it so many times. Let's follow another one here. Oh, this is a second rank defense that I believe you saw in an earlier segment. And wins the rook. But since that was seen in an earlier segment, let's see if we can look at maybe the end of one of these actual games here where somebody made a complete checkmate. This is like a second rank defense at first because the rook is very close. You have to be very careful if you put the queen 2 squares from the corner. Obviously, this is a suboptimal implementation because we saw white repeat some moves here. If the king goes to any white square, there may be a way to win the rook. The white king is in the way from going here, but now he's not. And this is like the harassment defense with the rook on the same diagonal as the white king. It's harder for white to find a way to win the rook. He checks him again, and after the king moves, he goes here, check, here. He would like to win the rook, of course. And now we get to the standard third rank defense again. So check, and he'll bring the king up. Now the queen would really like to guard this square diagonally. Okay. Now the queen does guard this, so probably I'm expecting him to bring king closer, check, in here. Again, this is what we're after, kings facing each other, and the queen diagonally guards the square between them. So this starts the third rank defense pattern, which you would become very familiar with once you see this a few times. The rook is going to keep harassing, the queen keeps harassing the rook until it gets to go to the bishop file. And then it pulls back to what would be bishop 4 after it makes the rook move there. And we get to this position over and over. Now from here we get that same recognizable pattern that you've seen a few times now. And it seems strange to move the king here instead of to f6, but of course f6 would let black skewer the queen with rook f7 check. Continuing, check, and then the queen goes to the same diagonal as the king. And now again the king on the same diagonal as the rook. Normally they put the king here, but now white cannot take this rook or he will make a stalemate. So white temporarily causes this rook to have to move, and then there's the check. The rook is able to save itself. Now everything's on one diagonal, and now all white has to do is create Philidor's position. Bam, there it is. Now from here you should be able to watch segment 1 to know that all of black's moves there are losing. Check in the middle. If the king goes to h6, we mate him, so he has to go to the 8th rank. White wants to win the rook from g1, so he has to check from the side first. So the queen needs to keep its eye on h1 in the corner. If the king goes here, white can mate in one move, so the king is now forced to the h-file. That enables white to go to the corner with check and to follow with queen g1 winning the rook. And of course you should be able to win on your own from there. So this concludes segment 3 of 4. In the final one we'll show you some actual complete games with the king and queen against the king and rook. And then I'll have some links to some other people's videos on this, because I will never do any more videos on this. I really think it's, as I've said, not a good thing to spend your time on. It would be like learning Koine Greek or some other language that's never used anymore. Learning Roman numerals if you don't use them. So, thanks for watching. I'll see you.